Elias Calder had always imagined his apartment as a harbor for stories nobody else had time to read. China cabinets groaned under rows of porcelain phantoms, and picture frames crowded the walls like gossiping onlookers. Yet the true heart of the place was a maple wood bookcase at the far end of the living room. Instead of novels or encyclopedias, every shelf was lined with snow globes, each resting on its own velvet coaster, each marked with a handwritten brass plaque, a sleepy Bavarian hamlet, a Victorian skating pond, a tiny moon base where astronauts kicked up static flakes. He had been collecting since he was 12, hunting flea markets and estate sales as though the globes were constellations waiting to be catalogued. The collection stayed polite and delicate until the night he found the cedar crate. Rain had forced the closing of the Thursday antique fair, and Elias wound up in the back of a van with a seller who swore she never traveled with unverified merchandise. The crate was almost weightless, yet the moment he unclasped it, a mineral chill breathed against his face. Inside, cushioned by shredded newspaper from 1919, lay 6 globes whose glass seemed to darken at the touch of air. They were heavy, the kind of heavy that reminded him of sleeping next to someone you loved, an awareness that pressed and refused to be ignored. He paid in cash and hurried home, more excited than he had been in months. The sky over the city wheezed sleet. Streetlights showed swirling particles that looked suspiciously like the imprisoned storms he carried in a grocery bag. By the time he reached his door, his fingertips were pleated with cold. Each of the 6 newcomers possessed a base carved from blackwood, symbols the size of pinheads looped around their circumference, glyphs that flickered between alphabets he couldn't read. Inside, nothing resembled the cheerful scenes he was used to. There were no houses, no Christmas trees, no cartoon polar bears. Instead, only jagged pillars of quartz poked through a scoured plain, and wind currents curled in spirals so dense that they hid the base of the pillars completely. No wonder the woman had seemed relieved to be rid of them. He set the globes on the coffee table and switched on every lamp, hungry to see the weather inside them. One by one, he shook them. Snow flurried exactly as expected, but a second form of precipitation soon followed. Slivers of what looked like black ash, glinting like obsidian confetti. The mixture was oddly hypnotic, a snowfall that refused to decide whether it was day or night. And then something impossible happened. The pillars inside the first globe quivered. Elias dropped to a crouch, hands braced on the table's edge, afraid the glass might be cracking. But the glass was intact. Instead, the landscape itself had expanded, as though the entire diorama had inhaled. The pillars rose taller, and their quartz tips flashed white. Wind whistled from nowhere, ripping across the living room and rattling picture frames on the walls. Every lamp flickered. One bulb popped, spraying purple sparks like pricked fireflies. He laughed, the short, shocked laugh of a scientist who suspects the laws of physics have just resigned. Another shake. This time, the storm inside the second globe tilted outward. Elias saw flares of sapphire lightning arch from the miniature sky and score the inside of the glass. A prickle of static raced up his forearms. Snow he hadn't touched slid off a freestanding bookcase. With mounting disbelief, he realized that the weather within the globes was leaking, if only by a hairbreadth, into his apartment. Sleep became the first casualty. He sat up until dawn, a blanket around his shoulders, alternately studying the globes and the frost halos forming on his windows. Every so often, drifted bits of ice scuttled across the hardwood like crumbs possessed by magnets. By sunrise, he had convinced himself this was a marvel to be documented, not feared. A collector's gift, he whispered, scribbling notes. He imagined a monograph, a keynote lecture, the faces of skeptical academics melting into envy. But the frost did not wait for peer review. On the second night, the temperature in the apartment plunged. Radiators clicked and wheezed ineffectually. Crystals spiderwebbed across the television screen. When he breathed, the air seemed to divide around the vapor of his exhale, like curtains parting. Still, He could not resist. He lifted the third globe, the largest, and gave it a single, deliberate shake. Everything fractured. The blizzard inside the globe ignited into a cyclone, an albino monster swirling faster than any jarred snow had a right to move. A thunderous pop rolled through the apartment. Elias staggered back, arms flung before his face. A white wall roared outward from the coffee table, devouring his sofa, his rug, his memory of warmth. He smelled ozone and tasted salt. He couldn't hear his own gasping over the shriek of wind. And then, almost politely, the tempest slowed, drawing itself back toward the globes like a cat retracting claws. The room was wrecked. Frost caked the ceiling. Every surface shimmered beneath a parchment of ice. Elias tried to scoop a handful, but the ice retreated under his palm, shrinking as though evaporating. Only then did he see that the globes themselves were breathing. Each one exhaled mist. Each one glowed faintly, an inner phosphor that pulsed in time with the beating of a heart he could not locate. He should have called someone, he told himself. The police, a historian of occult relics, his stalwart cousin in Minneapolis, who believed nothing could surprise the Midwest. Instead, he spent the dawn pacing circuits around the coffee table, making observations and chewing the skin around his thumbs until it bled. When language failed him, he whispered questions directly to the globes. "What do you want from me?" The answer came as snow that slipped from midair and melted on his wrist. The cold became tangible, a sly animal stalking closer each hour. By the fourth day, the hallway outside his apartment had its own weather. Neighbors slipped on rime that formed only outside Elias's door. Radiator pipes froze solid. Someone called a super who cursed and blamed city infrastructure. Elias listened to the quarrel through the peephole, feelings a counterfeit calm. They had no idea. The storm was localized, personal even. A collector storm. That night, he dreamed differently. He was tiny, like a plastic shepherd in a nativity set, standing in a bowl of white quartz under an aurora that sang. He lifted his hand to touch a pillar, and the pillar rippled like hot glass. When he woke, he found a splinter of quartz on his pillow no larger than a fingernail but cold enough to numb the skin. He locked it inside a desk drawer, yet a phantom chill lingered in the bones of his index finger. The fifth day's sunrise looked bruised. In the dim copper light, Elias noticed frost rings on the floor beneath each globe. The rings were expanding, widening circles of opaque ice that ate the sheen off the hardwood. He knelt, breath smoking, and traced a fingertip along the innermost ring. It felt alive, pliant like cartilage, and moving ever so slowly. The ring was shrinking the radius of the floor it claimed, the way a snake might coil around prey before constricting. A terrible deduction budded. The storm was not simply crossing into his apartment, it was building a cage. The globes were no longer passive curiosities. They were machines with an objective. And he, the collector, was both witness and raw material. A rational person, Elias thought, would abandon the apartment. He packed a satchel with passports and phone chargers, but when he reached for the door, the brass knob was engulfed in frost, so hungry it hissed. He tugged. The knob tore away in his hand like a brittle tooth. Beyond the peephole, the hall was gone, replaced by blank white fog. No footsteps, no voices. The building might have vanished too. Whatever the globes were doing, they had swallowed the outside world first. He returned to the living room. The globes awaited him in a neat row, blackwood bases stark against a landscape that was no longer his. Ice climbed the legs of the coffee table like ivy, and snow eddied in corners where dust bunnies once congregated. Through the glass of the globes he saw scenes that had grown far more detailed. Chasms, spires, cataracts of snow pouring into bottomless crevasses. They were not miniatures anymore. They were distant panoramas. One could enter, panoramas that were preparing to enter him. Elias made tea purely to watch steam crawl, a last rebellion against freeze. While the kettle rattled, he discovered something new. On the underside of each globe's base hid a tiny lever, narrow as a guitar string, The levers must have been why the blackwood felt ridged beneath his grip, a pattern his mind had ignored in all the commotion. One lever, he thought, equaled one choice: brakes for the storm or detonators. He carried the smallest globe to the window, where a monochrome mid-morning leaked through. Snow beyond the glass was no longer New York snow. The flakes were square-edged, geometric crystals, spiraling through symmetrical pathways. The city architecture looked softened, as though the horizon were a charcoal sketch into which someone kept blending an eraser. He couldn't be sure if what he saw was illusion or the beginning of world-scale transformation. He pulled the lever. It clicked, a percussive sound that echoed above the hum of the kettle. The globe shuddered in his hands. The storm within stilled, then parted like theater curtains. Where the gale had churned, a doorway opened, luminous and rectangular, no bigger than a matchbook, yet it radiated depth. On reflex, he tilted his head as if to peer down a corridor. What he saw made his scalp crawl. Himself, kneeling in a cavern of quartz, dozens of copies of himself, each nested deeper inside, like reflections in parallel mirrors. His hands convulsed, almost dropping the globe. The copy that was farthest away raised its head and mouthed a word he could not hear, but nevertheless understood. Enter. Whether the invitation was benevolent or malicious no longer mattered. The real room was shrinking. The frost rings under the remaining globes had advanced beyond the coffee table, seizing chairs and lamp cords. The ceiling radiated hairline fractures, shards ready to spear downward. The universe was diminishing to make room for other dimensions, and the fulcrum of collapse rested upon his possession. If he went willingly, perhaps the encroachment would end. If he resisted, the storm might devour everything. He set the first globe aside and reached for another, the one whose landscape hummed louder than the rest. He felt vibrations pass into his sternum. Lever pulled. He dared one more question. Will I be prisoner or custodian? The globe answered with a sigh of wind that escaped through the glass itself. A white ribbon unwound, curling toward him, unfurling like a lover's hand in ballroom invitation. Where the ribbon passed, ice sheeting peeled from the furniture and reassembled into archways of crystal. Elias walked forward, shoulders shivering but eyes steady. He carried no luggage but the smallest globe in his pocket, unsure why he chose that souvenir except it felt wrong to leave it lonely. The ribbon widened into a corridor of airborne snowflakes, each flake suspended, refusing gravity. He tasted metal and pine sap. The living room behind him twisted, walls bending inward as if suctioned. The corridor borrows your sighs, a voice muttered. His voice, the one that always narrated research papers inside his skull. It dawned on him that anatomy might be relative where he was going. Already his boots slid on flooring that glittered like starlight caught in poured glass. When he glanced over his shoulder, the aperture he had exited had sealed. The apartment was now a flattened slice of image, as if pinned like a photograph on a light table, soon eclipsed by mist. He continued until he reached a precipice. Below sprawled the geography he had witnessed in the globe. Pillars of quartz, their roots hidden beneath surfacing snow, violet auroras yoking the sky, but scale had lied. Each pillar was unimaginably tall, some perhaps hollow, others ringed with terraces like spines of ancient cathedrals. A snowstorm rampaged between them, but the snow held a curious, lucid glow, as though imbued with moon milk. Elias realized he stood on a balcony grown from the crystal trunk of a pillar. Balustrades sprouted like frost flowers around him, leaving an opening precisely his width. The design had anticipated him. He heard, faintly, the clink of glass behind his ribs. The pocketed globe pulsed warm, a strange comfort here where even the air felt warm. A strange comfort here where even the air felt warm. A strange comfort here where even the air felt warm. A pocketed globe pulsed, warm, a strange comfort here where even the air felt warm. A strange comfort here where even the air felt warm. A strange comfort here where even the air felt warm. He drew it out. Inside, his abandoned living room floated intact, encased like a toy stage. His own figure was absent, but the globe still rested on the coffee table. Storms muted, cages completed. Time there was now slower, or maybe sealed entirely. Observer and observed had traded positions. A possibility bloomed. Each globe was a reliquary for worlds, but also a chrysalis for travelers who dared to engage. Collectors became collections. That night, he had first met the cedar crate. He had in fact been invited to participate in a tradition older than the languages engraved upon the blackwood. The shrinking ice was never meant to kill. It was a scissor motion, trimming loose threads of reality so the weave could be reknotted. Wind carried whispered phrases, syllables cracking like frozen twigs. He could parse no meaning, yet cadence suggested lullabies. Then one gust shoved him forward. Balance gone, he tumbled from the balcony. Gravity existed but behaved inconsistently. He fell through streamers of light that parted to reveal plateaus coiled around pillar stalks. Snow sprayed upward, cushioning each collision. When he stood, flakes clung to his eyelashes in fractal prisms, refracting constellations he couldn't name. He guessed night here was a season satisfied to occupy minutes rather than hours. The geography urged exploration. Pathways carved themselves, footbridges of fused ice stretching over canyons, staircases rotating from within the pillars like threads on a screw. With each step he felt an alignment, the way a tuning fork resonates when struck in the key of the room. He sensed other presences nearby, former collectors perhaps, or native custodians. He glimpsed silhouettes navigating different strata of quartz. Some carried lanterns the size of thimbles. Others wore mantles woven from radiant flakes that refused to melt. He lifted both hands, palms open, a sign of truce. One figure approached, undeniably human, though its skin bore vein-like lattices of frosted silver. The stranger's eyes were sapphire ice. A voice entered Elias's thoughts, calm as intertidal hush. "You have turned the levers. You have crossed." "Where am I?" Elias asked aloud. His voice crystallized midair, the shards twirling away like dandelion fluff. "Inside the memory, your world shakes when it wishes for wonder. Some arrive by accident, most by hunger. Which are you?" "A collector," he answered, "and now, perhaps, an exhibit." This produced what felt like amusement inside his skull. "Exhibit, yes, but curator too, if you choose." The stranger indicated the globe Elias still clutched. "Every passage requires balance. What you take, you must also hold." Elias studied the miniature Manhattan apartment imprisoned under glass. In this inertia, his houseplants were mid-sag. Drops of tea hovered above the kettle spout, mid-exhale. The image wobbled when he breathed. If he became curator, he realized, he might guide where and how storms crossed, prevent the next collector from being ambushed, yet he would forfeit returning. He thought of mundane life, email passwords, tax forms, the way the corner bakery's neon sign bled red across wet pavement. He felt no ache for them. Wonder had snared him long before tonight. This was only the invoice becoming due. "I choose to stay," he said. The stranger reached out. Fingers pressed the globe, and filaments of frost crawled from their nails to the glass, sealing it with runes identical to those on the black wood base. The miniature storm inside the apartment dilated, then slowed, settling like shaken glitter at rest. The scene crystallized into stillness, a snow globe again, harmless to any future owner, unless they found the lever Elias knew to hide. "You will learn the weathers," the stranger announced, "not to master them, but to converse. The storm is language that has not yet agreed to an alphabet." In silence, Elias followed, ascending a spiraled pier of ice that extended skyward. Along the route, other globes waited on pedestals scalloped from quartz. He understood each pedestal represented another collected world, another curator standing sentinel somewhere in the architecture of storms. Perhaps millennia might pass before his post changed hands, or perhaps mere days. Time was a courtesy measured by whoever shook the glass. Far above, the aurora rippled. Beneath its light, blizzards roved, obeying pathways curved like calligraphy strokes. Elias felt the apartment globe cool against his palm, until temperature became a suggestion rather than sensation. Snow swirled gently in the violet dark, and he walked on. Equal parts minute and infinite, learning with every heartbeat how to read the hush between flakes.